Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today's slate will be a 5-game Major League Baseball slate. It's a little smaller slate at 7 o'clock, but we do have some very interesting games in this one with Akayam in Colorado. These games should be pretty good. We have a decent set of pitchers available. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? Also drop home run comments in the comments below, with your home run calls, and I'll shout you out in the next video. Before I get into it here, my core plays Otani, Alvarez for Mets, and then Suzuki for Chicago Cubs. So let's go and get into our pitchers here. We're going to start with Otani, who is the most expensive option. He is a very good matchup here against Miami. He's got a good K rate, and he's facing a subpar team. He is a top-tier option. He is obviously extremely expensive, but he is very viable here on this slate. Then we'll look at Justin Verlander, who is a good contrarian option. He is high risk, high reward, though, since this game's in Colorado. He could score 30 fantasy points or more in this game, but he could also score under a negative score. Colorado games tend to be pretty wild, so I do think that he's going to have some risk here. So he is a contrarian play, but he still has some value. Then we're going to look at Tanner Bigby for BB for Cleveland against St. Louis. I don't love the matchup here, but he has some upside here with a decent K rate. He's definitely viable on the slate. He's had some ups and downs throughout the season, and this matchup is hard, but is still viable in a small slate like this as a contrarian option. Then we'll look at Edward Cabrera for Miami. He's hard to trust here due to the matchup, but he does get a decent amount of strikeouts. He also gives up a few earned runs each game. He does have a low floor, but he has an average expectation here. I definitely could see him getting to this 20 fantasy point range. Obviously, it's going to be somewhat difficult, but it's definitely viable on the slate. And then finally, we're going to look at Jack Flaherty, who for St. Louis is facing Cleveland, and the matchup doesn't seem all that terrible, though I do like a couple Cleveland options on the slate. I do think getting 25 fantasy points would be a bit of a stretch on this particular slate, but he definitely draws some upside as a result of his matchup and price. So I do think he's in a good spot here. Looking into the catchers here, we're going to start with Francisco Alvarez, who's very cheap, has really good metrics for this game, has great matchup, and obviously being in Colorado against subpar pitching. This matchup's a little bit better than it was yesterday even, so I do think he's a top-tier play. Then we're going to look at Wilson Contreras for St. Louis. Now, he's got some interesting upside here, despite the fact he hasn't hit the ball very well very much lately. He definitely, if he draws a start, he'll have home run potential here. The matchup is interesting, but he does have some low-end upside just due to the fact that he hasn't hit the ball very well. Then we'll look at Yan Gomez for Chicago Cubs. He's actually hit the ball pretty solid this season, and he really has good metrics for this game. I thought about not putting a catcher as a core play because you could really mix or match Alvarez and Gomez, but we'll have to wait and see who actually starts those games because both those guys are not everyday starters. Then we'll look at first base. Before I do that, for catcher, there's plenty of good value options at this position. I don't really think there's any reason to pay up here, but there's good value plays, so I think that makes it a very good slate for catchers today. Moving into the first baseman, we'll look at Pete Alonso, who's pretty expensive here, but if you can afford to roster him, which you can definitely, depending on how you do pitching, he has really good metrics for this game again, and he should have some good upside in this matchup. Some cheaper options you can roll with are Josh Naylor for Cleveland. Now, he does face Flaherty, who I do like okay, but I do like Cleveland as well some as a smaller contrarian stack. He's got good metrics despite a decently tough matchup, and he definitely has some usability here at a cheap price point. And then we'll look at Vientos for the Mets. If he does draw a start today, he'll have some low-end upside here as a guy that can get, random home runs. But he definitely still feels a little risky unless he draws a start, which he hasn't been drawing many starts. But he does have great metrics here. Maybe then, before I get to the next position here, at first base does seem like a decent position. There's good value here and a good expensive options, but there's not a ton of great options. Moving to second base, we'll look at Jeff McNeil first. He really didn't do anything yesterday, but I do think he's got some upside again in this matchup. The Mets only scored 5 runs yesterday. I really did expect them to score more, though they were also pretty chalky. But they're going to be chalky again today, but on a smaller slate like this, you probably could fit a couple of them in any way you want to make your lineup when it comes to stacks. Then we'll look at Nolan Gorman, who's a little bit more expensive. He's got decent metrics here, and the matchup is okay. It's not a great matchup, but it's an okay matchup. And he has home run potential, which he's been hitting quite well this season. At second base, I don't really love the position, but there is some value. It's just a pretty weak position. There's not much beyond those options. Moving on to third base here, we're going to start with Rafael Devers, who's obviously extremely expensive. He does have mega metrics for this matchup, though he has been pretty rough the last week or so. So I do think he's risky, but he definitely draws some utility. Brett Baty for the Mets, also very interesting today. He has hit the ball pretty well as of late. Despite the fact he only has a 250 batting average, he does have some boomer bust potential here. A little bit risky, but he's definitely a guy as a contrarian option for a Mets stack. And then Josh Rojas, who has been inconsistent this season for Arizona, but he definitely draws some utility here. He's an interesting matchup, but has solid solid matchup metrics. However, he's more of a stolen base guy than he is a home run guy. But I do think he's got some utility in this matchup at his price point. Third base has good value across the board. You can find lots of good options at different price ranges here. Moving into shortstop, we'll look at Francisco Lindor, who had a monster game here against Colorado yesterday with 25 fantasy points. I look for him to have the opportunity to do that again. The metrics are good, and the matchup is great again. But a contrarian option off him is Dansby Swanson for Chicago Cubs. He's been playing pretty solid as of late, and I really like his upside here, though he is about the same price as Lindor. There are several good options at shortstop in this price range, but there's not many cheap value plays, so I definitely think it's a good position to kind of pay up at. Moving into the outfielders, we're going to start with Mike Trout as a top tier option. He has some really good upside in this matchup. He's hit the ball extremely well lately, and I like his potential for home runs. He obviously is super expensive and hard to roster as a result, but he's definitely viable on the slate. Then we'll look at Yoshida for Boston. I really like Boston as a team. However, everybody does feel overpriced, including him. So he is viable, but he's going to be extremely hard to roster. It's going to be hard to make a Boston stack with the way that the pricing is on the team. And then Corbin Carroll, he is another good option. He has played pretty solid this season. He's got some really good metrics here, has home run potential, and he's hitting the ball pretty well. So I like his upside in this plus matchup here against Boston. For some value plays, we'll look at Brandon Nimmo for the Mets. His price is just tapped up above what we really want it to be, but it's a little bit cheaper than it was yesterday. And it was kind of annoying that he had jumped up almost to 5,000 yesterday, but he's back down to 4,500, and that's usually about the max I like to play him. Granted, he ended up hitting 2 triples yesterday. He's actually had 3 triples the last 2 games. Having this game in Colorado definitely gives him a little bit of advantage as well. Then we'll look at Starling Marte for the Mets. He's also in play today, despite not hitting the ball all that well and had a rough game yesterday. I do expect him to bounce back here with good metrics in this game. Then we'll look at Quan for Cleveland. Now, he is somewhat risky, but he's one of the 2 guys I really do like on Cleveland, and his price is still pretty fair. He has stolen base potential, and he has good metrics for hitting, so I do like his upside in this particular matchup. He hasn't hit the home runs, though, which he's not really that big of a home run hitter, so he's not a big threat from that perspective. Then we'll look at Suzuki for the Cubs. He's hitting the ball really well the last few games, and I like his upside here. He's got home run potential, and he is one of the better players on the Cubs as of late, and so I do think he's very viable on the slate. Lars Nootbaar is also in play for St. Louis, and St. Louis is kind of a sneaky team today as well. They have a good matchup, and I do like the potential for their guys here, though they are somewhat high risk just because Bibby can also have some good games occasionally. So I do think the slate is pretty interesting. As for the outfielders, there's good value across the board and decent top tier options, but there's not a lot of super cheap plays at this position. Overall, though, I do think the slate's fairly good and it should have some pretty good scoring despite the smaller slate size. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.